Well, folks, buckle up for this deep dive. We're jumping straight into a situation that's unfolding as we speak. We're talking South Korea and we're talking martial law.
Yeah, it's a pretty unprecedented move, especially when you consider South Korea's journey to becoming a democracy. It wasn't that long ago that they were grappling with authoritarian rule, so this declaration really has people on edge.
We're digging through a ton of news here, all from today, December 3rd, the New York Times, CNN, Reuters, CNBC, you name it. We're trying to piece together why President Yoon decided on this drastic measure and what it all means, not just for South Korea, but for the bigger picture too.
What's really striking is that for South Koreans, martial law isn't just some abstract legal term. I mean, it carries a lot of historical baggage. It's linked to times of oppression, crackdowns, military control. So for a country that fought so hard for its democratic freedoms, you can imagine this is causing some serious anxiety.
Yeah, it's like hitting the rewind button on their political progress.
Yeah.
And the reaction so far, utter chaos. We're seeing protests erupt outside the National Assembly. Lawmakers are scrambling to figure out how to counter Yoon's decree. The media's in a frenzy, and even the South Korean one is taking a hit. Investors definitely don't like uncertainty.
And the international community is watching this very closely, too. We've got cautious statements from the White House, the Chinese embassy. Taiwan's definitely on high alert. This has the potential to really shake up alliances and power dynamics in the entire region.
So let's break this down. Yoon's late night address was basically a barrage of accusations aimed squarely at the opposition Democratic Party. And he didn't hold back.
No, he didn't. He's accusing them of, well, plotting an insurgency, saying they're actively working to overthrow free democracy.
Strong words.
Really strong words.
And it seems like Yoon's argument hinges on the fact that the Democratic Party has a majority in the National Assembly, and he's claiming they've been using that majority to basically sabotage his ability to govern.
Right, like he's pointing to all these impeachment motions they've filed against his cabinet members, how they've blocked his budget proposals, even those attempts to impeach key figures within his administration.
He's really painting them as this destructive force. I mean, he even called the National Assembly a monster that's actually, in his words, destroying democracy, not protecting it. That's not just your everyday political disagreement. That's a full-on attack.
Yeah, it's definitely a very loaded accusation, especially given South Korea's history. I mean, similar claims were used to justify authoritarian rule in the past, so using that kind of language is only going to escalate tensions.
Then you've got the North Korea angle. Yoon throws that in there too, claiming he needs to root out pro-North Korean anti-state forces. But it's all incredibly vague. No details, no evidence.
And that's what's so interesting, that vagueness. It's like he's tapping into these deeply rooted fears and anxieties about North Korea without actually giving any concrete reasons to be worried. It's a way to potentially rally the public against this kind of undefined threat.
So we've got this political gridlock, escalating tensions with North Korea, and now this bombshell of a martial law declaration. What's the other side of the story? How's the opposition responding to all of this?
Well, the opposition leader, Lee Jae-myung, is definitely not mincing words either. He's calling Yoon's justification completely baseless, saying it's a blatant power grab. He's basically calling it a coup in disguise.
Wow.
Yeah, he's urging citizens to go to the National Assembly to protest this declaration, and he's even calling on the military to disobey Yoon's orders. That's a bold move, really shows they're digging in for a fight.
So you've got these two completely opposing narratives, but let's step back for a second and look at the practical side of things. What does martial law actually mean for everyday life in South Korea?
Well, the immediate impact is pretty dramatic. It's a complete shutdown of all political activity. No political parties can operate, no rallies, no labor demonstrations, nothing. And it goes even further than that. The Martial Law Command now has control over all media and publications. They're threatening to arrest anyone who spreads what they consider fake news.
It sounds like a total information blackout.
Yeah, and things are getting even more tense because they're deploying soldiers to the National Assembly. I mean, it was already a chaotic scene with police and protesters clashing, so adding soldiers to the mix, well, it's not exactly going to calm things down.
And the thing is, we don't even know how long this martial law is supposed to last, or what the specific measures are going to be, or what Yoon considers success in this situation. It's all very unsettling.
Definitely. And you can't ignore the historical context here either. It's been 44 years since South Korea last saw martial law. That was during the 1980 pro-democracy uprising against military rule. So this isn't just another political headline. It's reopening old wounds and raising some really big questions about the future of democracy in South Korea.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. Really makes you think about the challenges of transitioning to a democracy, right? It's rarely straightforward.
It does make you wonder. With all this going on, political gridlock, tensions with North Korea, and now this martial law declaration, does it point to some kind of fundamental weakness in South Korean democracy itself? I mean, is it really that fragile?
Well, Yoon's whole argument is that the opposition has become such a disruptive force that they're actually the ones posing the real threat to democracy. He's basically saying their actions are so extreme that his response is justified. But of course, the opposition's pushing back hard, saying this is just a power grab, using the North Korea threat and this idea of an insurgency to justify a return to authoritarianism.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating, so complex. It's a battle of narratives, a clash of interpretations about what actually constitutes a threat to democracy. Both sides claim to be the real defenders of democracy, and it's up to the South Korean people and maybe the courts to decide who they believe.
I want to go back to Yoon's speech for a minute. The language he uses is really striking. I mean, he calls the National Assembly a den of criminals, a monster that destroys democracy. Those are pretty inflammatory statements.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's not just your typical political rhetoric. He's very deliberately trying to demonize the opposition, to create this us versus them mentality where anyone who disagrees with them is automatically labeled an enemy. It's a classic tactic used by leaders who are, well, trying to consolidate their power and silence any dissent.
And he goes on to list all these examples of what he calls obstructionism, like all those impeachment motions against government officials, blocking his budget proposals, trying to impeach key figures in his administration. He's really laying out his case, trying to convince the public that he had no other choice, that he was backed into a corner.
But what's really interesting is how vague he is about the North Korea threat. He keeps talking about these pro-North Korean anti-state forces, but he doesn't offer any concrete evidence. It's like he's saying, trust me, there's a danger here, but I can't tell you about it because it's top secret.
Which, of course, makes it impossible to verify or challenge his claims. It creates this atmosphere of suspicion and fear where people are more likely to react emotionally than think critically. It's a very effective way to consolidate power during a perceived crisis. Invoke an enemy, real or imagined, and then present yourself as the only one who can protect people.
It's a tried and true playbook. And then you look at the international reaction, and it's definitely a mixed bag. The U.S. is saying they're monitoring the situation closely, which is basically diplomatic speak for we're really worried and trying to figure out what to do. I mean, South Korea is a key ally in a really strategically important region, and this sudden upheaval throws a wrench into everything.
They're probably worried about how this affects their ability to work with South Korea on North Korea's nuclear program or China's growing influence or just maintaining stability in the region.
Yeah.
And don't forget, President Biden's in Angola right now, so he's dealing with this from afar.
Yeah, that adds another layer of complexity for sure. It's just a lot harder to have those crucial high-level conversations when you're not there in person. And the financial markets are definitely reacting to this uncertainty. I mean, the South Korean won is plummeting against the US dollar as investors get nervous.
It's a reminder of how interconnected the world is, right? Political instability in one country can have a ripple effect on the global economy, on trade, on investment, and ultimately on people's lives.
It's true, and it's something people often forget. It's easy to think of geopolitics as this abstract game played by world leaders, but it really does have real-world consequences for everyone.
Speaking of consequences, we have to talk about the dissent within Yoon's own party. Han Dong-hoon, a leader in Yoon's People Power Party, is publicly saying that the martial law declaration is wrong and is vowing to work against it. That's not just some fringe element. It's a sign that this move has fractured Yoon's own base of support.
Yeah, that's a really important development. It suggests that Yoon might have miscalculated, that he may have underestimated the level of pushback he'd face, both domestically and internationally. He might have actually weakened his position instead of strengthening it.
So we've got all these factors in play. It begs the question, what happens next? What are the long-term implications of this martial law declaration? Is this a temporary thing, a show of force that eventually fades away? Or is this a real turning point, a step toward a more authoritarian future for South Korea?
It's hard to say for sure at this point. We're in uncharted territory. But what we do know is that this situation has exposed some real fault lines within South Korean democracy, fault lines that could get a lot worse if they aren't addressed.
And it's also highlighted how interconnected our world is, how a political crisis in one country can have ripple effects that spread far beyond its borders, affecting economies, alliances, the global balance of power, everything.
Right, the stakes are incredibly high.
So, as we dig deeper into these sources, let's try to unpack these potential scenarios, weigh the possible outcomes, and really understand what's at stake for South Korea, the region, and the world. Feels like we're watching, I don't know, like a high-stakes poker game, except the chips on the table are the future of South Korean democracy. And it's really hard to say at this point if Yoon's holding a winning hand or if he's, bluffing his way into a corner.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely taking a gamble. He's betting that this show of force will, silence the critics, allow him to get things done and really solidify his control. But as we've seen, there's a lot of pushback already, not just from the opposition, but even from his own party and the international community.
So let's try to game this out a little. What's the best case scenario for Yoon at this point?
Well, I guess the most optimistic outcome for him would be if the protests fizzle out, the international community kind of accepts his explanation, and he uses this period of martial law to assert his authority. Basically, he rides out the storm and comes out stronger on the other side.
But that almost feels like a superficial victory, like sweeping the problem under the rug instead of actually dealing with the underlying political divisions. What about the other end of the spectrum? What's the worst case scenario here?
Well, the flip side is that the backlash just keeps growing. The National Assembly could successfully challenge his martial law declaration in court. The protests could escalate, and he could be forced to resign or even face impeachment. That would be a pretty dramatic downfall.
And then there's that middle ground, which can sometimes be the most unsettling possibility. What if neither side backs down? The protests continue, the political deadlock just gets deeper, and the country descends into this prolonged period of instability, maybe even violence.
Yeah, that's a real possibility, and it's a scary one. It's what makes this situation so unpredictable, so volatile. Any miscalculation, any overreach could have, disastrous consequences, especially with North Korea always lurking in the background.
This whole thing really makes you think about the bigger picture. We talk about South Korea's hard-won democracy, their transition from authoritarianism. But how easily can a country slide back? Are democratic institutions really that fragile?
It's a good question, and it's a sobering one. What we're seeing in South Korea is a reminder that democracy isn't, some kind of finished product. It's an ongoing process, a delicate balance that requires constant attention, participation, and a willingness to compromise.
It's easy to take those freedoms for granted, to assume that progress is always going to move forward. But this situation is a stark reminder that backsliding can happen anywhere, even in countries with established democratic traditions.
And it also highlights how interconnected our world is. What happens in one part of the world can have ripple effects that spread everywhere. The outcome of the situation won't just shape South Korea's future, it could influence the global balance between democracy and authoritarianism.
This deep dive has been, well, it's been a lot to process, a lot of information, a lot of analysis, and I got to say, it's left me feeling pretty uneasy. We've uncovered some really important insights, but it's clear that the situation in South Korea is still very much in flux. I mean, nobody really knows what's going to happen next.
Yeah, and I think that's the key takeaway here. We have to be careful about jumping to conclusions or assuming we know how this is all going to play out. The situation it's complex. The people involved have a lot of different motivations, and the stakes are incredibly high. The best we can do is stay informed, to really think critically about the information we're getting, and to recognize that this is a story that's still being written.
So for our listeners out there, this deep dive isn't just about understanding a political crisis that's happening halfway around the world. It's about understanding the fragility of democracy, the importance of being engaged citizens, and the fact that we're all connected. What happens in South Korea, in a way, it happens to all of us.
And as we continue to follow this story, I think the question that's going to stay with us is, will this be remembered as the moment President Yoon solidified his power or the moment he, set in motion his own downfall? We'll just have to wait and see.